Welcome everyone. Hopefully you'll see me here in the corner as well, so I might occasionally just gesticulate towards you. And then welcome to this another episode of our webinar series where we like to kind of show the stuff that gets us excited. And you might think it's a little bit kind of strange to get excited about things like GridWarper tool, but it is actually exciting. It was just maybe 2 years ago when Nuke 10 came out, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and that was when they introduced SmartVectors, and I remember actual conversations in pubs with my other compositor friends, like, have you heard about SmartVectors? They're amazing. SmartVectors. So yes, that's actually the kind of thing that we actually get excited about, and yeah, we kind of look. So today, what we're going to be showing you guys is this latest development with this SmartVector toolset, that is the GridWarpTracker, and I will be kind of showing you a few things, which is that I'll show you the very basic of how you use a GridWarper. And the kind of most simple warping example, but I'll try to kind of show you a few things as well that relate to how you might actually use it in production. And let's start with this thing in here. So this is a shot that one of our students comped, and that's another one of our students, past students here, was in front of a green screen. And in this comp, we basically taken him and put him in front of some other video footage and put this tape from the video in there as well. And in order to kind of make this kind of stuff work, you really have to do all the integration and stuff. So, which involves things like whenever there's one of the flashes at the back, you kind of want this happening on him as well. And yeah, originally he was in front of a green screen. So this was one of my MA students who did this shot. Got a fairly good grade for this as well, because this was a keying exercise. We shoot these things ourselves. We have a good cinematographer who helps us with this, called Clem, who might be doing another webinar soon as well. And in keying exercises, what you're really looking for is getting all of this hair detail. So if you've ever spent any time staring at hair detail, you can stare at this as well, like, some good hair detail there. But that's not what this exercise is about. So what we're interested in is the new GridWarpTracker tool, and we'll just look at this little sequence in here. He looks around, thinks, and then listens something in his headpiece, and then kind of looks away. Let's call him Tom, by the way, because I think his name is Tom. So we'll just do a really kind of basic example of what warping is all about and how you might use all of this. I'm going to hide my thumbnails in here somewhere in the corner. Ooh, what does that do? Cool. Let's stay down there. And just float this window here. So the few kind of basic steps of setting up a GridWarp for tracking. It is nice to start on some kind of a frame that you choose as a reference frame, where you can see what you're kind of intending to do. So I think it would be nice if this guy smiled a little bit more. So you initially, when you start the GridWarpTracker and the old GridWarp node as well, the kind of nice thing about them is that it immediately works. As soon as you kind of start dragging things around, it immediately warps. So it's like, derp. So that's cool. But the way to really set this up is to kind of understand the concept that you have a source grid and a destination grid, and you are warping from one to another. So in a similar way, when those who have used Nuke, if you have a corner pin, let's look at one of those quickly as well. In a corner pin, we have these to and from points, which you have in those two tabs in here. And I'll quickly disable this. So I'll set my from points over here. So we're taking this image from this section, and when I enable this, we are taking it to the points that are in the to. So we go from there to there. And the important part in here is like, why would we do this? Well, basically, we might want to go from here to the edges of the image, or we might want to go to somewhere else in the image. So this is kind of classic planar tracking examples. So you might want to go from there to there. And the grid warp works the same way. You have two grids, source grid and the destination grid. And one very important part about both of them is that if the points are different, then there will be some warping effect. So yeah, you get from and to points, and you go from there to there. And the very important part is that if your from and to points are in the same place, so if I put both of them in there, then nothing will happen. And this is the very important principle. If your from and to points are in the same place, then nothing will happen. So important to say twice. So here, when we start, we have the source grid and destination grid exactly in the same places. So nothing is happening. There's no warping. And it's only as we start moving one of those grids, and we can see that now these two grids are different, that we are taking this point and warping it over there. So long explanation that there is two grids. So how do we use this? Well, first of all, we want the grid to be somewhere where we're at what we're interested in. And my workflow for this is that as I'm setting these things up, I like to disable this initially, because I might be moving one grid or another grid separately from each other. Then maybe I don't want them to be linked just yet, or like anything happening at that stage. So I'll just disable it, and I'm going to draw a small grid over here. Going to slightly gamma up my viewer so you can see a little bit better as well. And what we want to do is make him smile a little bit more. So the main trick with GridWarp is you want to leave a little bit of space beyond the things that you are going to manipulate. And you want to try to initially line up the grid with the features that you will be modifying. So here I'll be modifying his mouth and mustache. So I will be lining up those. Now, new to the GridWarpTracker is this button in here, which allows you to link your from and to grids. So as you're setting these things up initially, you want those two to be connected. So whatever you do to the source grid will happen to the destination grid at the same time. So it won't do any warping at that stage. So you can test this, making sure that you're moving things. Nothing is warping at this stage, so that's good. So we will use this to slightly line up things in here. Humming my lining up song. Hum, 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 hum. Hum, hum, hum. Lining up, lining up. You will notice as well, if you've already done some alignment, then as you're adding resolution with this plus button here, it will continue estimating that the existing curvature, and that's really nice actually. So do this a little bit tighter here, and I want a little bit more resolution here, and maybe this guy should kind of go a bit more over here, and let's put this one somewhere here. So that way we have most of his mouth covered, and I'm just going to put the rest of it sort of closer to his face, so it's actually on his face over there. Now, I'm not always a big fan of having it over black initially, kind of want to see it over the source footage to see what we're doing. And as we're making this alignment here with his original face, we want to select these things, press Z to match them better, make them smoother, so that basically takes the handles and adds the curvature to them. And you can just play with this curvature a little bit more if you need to be even smoother. And at this stage, I'm kind of happy with this. Don't really need too much for the nose over there. Just also I'm a little bit afraid it might slightly offset the smart vectors for that. Cool. So in the old days, you would now have to kind of navigate through the footage, take this grid, manually move it, and kind of rotoscope it effectively to match with the shape of the mouth, more or less in every single frame. You would use rotoscoping techniques, looking at the ends of the movements and putting keyframes in there, so you don't have to do every frame. But that's how you would have to do it. So kind of a long, boring process. But since Nuke 12, we have the option to use smart vectors to actually drive the positioning of this grid. And this is what smart vectors look like. Doesn't tell you anything. I mean, it tells you maybe something that they have values. But this is something you might want to do. Just look in front of look at this with the client and go like, while you're thinking what to do next. Cool. Sweet. So now that it's done, we want to track this. So I'm going to track this forward. During this time, if you want, you can hum a tracking song. Tracking. This does take a bit of time, mainly because smart vectors are actually heavy. They are using a GPU, which really helps. But they are heavy, and you kind of do need a good machine to do this quickly. So I'll show you in a moment as well a quick way to slightly speed up this process, to optimize it. Get rid of this corner pin. You already understand what that did. So now the good thing is you don't need to connect this smart vector anymore. You can disconnect it because the thing is, it only used the smart vectors to get the animation for this curve in there. Now that we have this animation, we don't actually need to keep it connected anymore. And that's the first good optimization process is that you might even get someone with a better computer to generate the smart vectors for you. You can you can render them out as EXR files, and then read it in if you don't have a good machine, or just leave these to render overnight, and then you can still use them. But now they're no longer needed in here. So now the important part is that we want to start manipulating these grids, just to give him a little bit of smile. So historically, you would only have one from and to grid in the GridWarp node, but that's the other part that they've changed in here, which is the whole interface of this, and they made it a lot easier. So thank you, Foundry, for making things easier for compositors. That's nice. So what you can do now is you can have another layer on top of this, which is an adjustment layer. At this stage as well, since I'm kind of now going to start manipulating these things, I might not want to keep these things linked anymore. I might actually not want to have the source and the kind of two grids visible anymore, because those things have lots of keyframes. Whereas now I have this grid that is following those other grids, but doesn't have any keyframes. And that's the one we can animate. So here we might just give it the keyframe in the beginning, where I want my animation to start, and in the end, where I want my animation to end, because I know that that's the grid that hasn't changed. So afterwards, there will be no change, and before this, there will be no change. But in the middle, we will add a little bit of animation there. So, and the animation that we're going to add to this, I'm just going to make sure that I actually have a keyframe there. I'm going to make this keyframe a little bit earlier over there. So what we want to do with this guy is just give him a little quick smile. So let's take some of his lip and mustache, and just a little bit like that, and just going to give it a bit of this as well. Okay, so and now he does this little smile on those 2 frames. It might be worth warping this nose a little bit too much. If you didn't want that to happen, you could try again and add more resolution. So you could add one more line here to keep the nose in place. Okay. So that way, if I'm not moving that will not move. So just going to add my adjustment again. And let's just move them a little bit, try to rotate them a bit. A quick 2-frame smile. And at the moment it's interpolated, so as the animation goes, this keyframe is kind of going down again, so his smile is slowly fading off. But I might want him to keep him smiling for a while, so I just need the same keyframe that I had over there. You can see my adjustment grid keyframes there, and these are all the other keyframes. These are all the keyframes that actually make it stick to the movement of the face. But I have 2 keyframes in the beginning and only 1 keyframe in the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reuse this keyframe here, because I don't like, doing things twice. So I'll just copy this keyframe. So there's this key and C button for copy the key frame button. And I'm going to go to the key button with the P next to it, which stands for paste. I'm going to paste it over there. There. So now I've taken the same keyframe done from there to the end over here. And what we have is a guy who's animated. Okay, I'm going to play this a little bit slower. I'm going to play this on full screen as well. And I'm actually going to turn off my GridWarper visibility. And I'm going to play this at sort of 12 frames per second, so it's a bit easier to see. So he looks at us, and here's on the phone. He's like, "Hey, you got dinner?" "Oh, it's a salad." "Oh, I got some ice cream." "Ah, it's pistachio." "Oh, okay." So that's kind of an example, and this is sort of the classic example. You can take an existing image and manipulate it a little bit. You can just warp it, and this is really, really nice, because sort of the other uses for this is that if you sometimes have like a still frame and you need to extend the footage, you can add a little bit of wobble to people. You can add a kind of a little bit of breathing to kind of a still frame of an animal or something like that. Whenever you need to just kind of do some small adjustments like that, or if you like the classic example that you see is if someone needs to be beaten up, you can just make give them a little bit of swelling, but that's not sort of the the only thing you can do with this. But that's the basic one. You take a grid, make sure that it matches the movement, and then you warp now the adjustment grid. And this is the new thing. You have these extra adjustment grids that you can add to put extra animation on top of this. And if you wanted to, you could do another one on top of this to maybe kind of give his lower lip a little bit of movement as well. I'm not an animator, so there's probably some better, clever ways of animating people by taking into consideration which muscles they have and stuff. But that's that section there. So, but quite often we might want to do something else with tracking. So if you've ever done any tracking, and then you kind of know that, just to show you this as well, that if I do a really quick track of, let's say, his nose, just for a few frames in here. So I track, and I track the other way, is that you know two things. Is that tracking can be used to do match moving, which is you recreate this movement. But tracking can also be used to do stabilization. So for example, in here, if I was to stabilize this one here, I could remove that movement. I can put him back to where he used to be. So you might kind of ask yourself that, we've just done a match move with the GridWarpTracker tool over there. Could we do the inverse of that? Can we undo that movement? And the answer is yes, and actually it's sort of relatively easy. So I'm going to do a new tracker for his face, and we just want to maybe do a little bit of kind of cleanup paint work on his face. So just a little bit, so that we can do a bit of painting in there. I'm quickly going to check the chat for a second, see if there's any other questions in here. So other cool questions there. So actually, yeah, the question of how do smart vectors work is slightly pertinent. So I'm going to answer that now. So smart vectors, they are very similar to the tracker tool. So what a tracker tool does, not that one, that's a different tracker. A tracker tool. The tracker tool looks for this little patch of footage in the next frame. You can see it's a little bit more that way. So if you go to the next frame, then you will have found it. So you're trying to kind of do this for that patch over there. How smart vectors work is by doing this not for this one point, but for every pixel in your image. So it will try to track every single pixel in your image. And this is why it is very heavy, and why you kind of need a good GPU to run this fast. So now you get information for every pixel in the image, and it stores this as this visual representation. I can tell you more, but in a longer lesson than today's one. Cool. By the way, that term is also known as optical flow. And often when you get optical flow, you get every pixel moving from this frame to the next frame. What the smart vectors do is they accumulate so that you will know where this thing goes from this frame to the next frame and the one after and the one after and the one after. And that's why you have to kind of have all the pixels in memory and the movement for this frame and every frame, which is the other reason why it's computationally heavy. But they've done a really good job at getting it to work on a GPU. So it's actually surprisingly fast. Anyways, so going back to this, this time around, I want to track a little bit of his face. So I'm going to do a GridWarpTracker, sort of somewhere around here. So tracking some of his cheek. And you can just do a little bit of this as well. Just kind of put it somewhere there. And actually, I'm going to view it over source again. I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger to include a little bit more of his nose as well. So just drag it more that way. And again, I just kind of I don't want the tracker to. So I'm going to link this first. I don't want the tracker to track too much of the things that are not his face. So I'm going to pick sort of frame 78 as my reference frame in here for now. You don't. This time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to paint out this little mole in here. So I just want to do a bit of texture tracking. So in the given case, I don't really need to actually align this with anything, you know, too specifically in my image. But it does help. And why it helps is that it helps you to kind of visualize afterwards if the tracking slides a little bit, because the SmartVectors are a very automatic tool. So over long periods of time, they just sort of slide off a little bit from each other. So putting these things next to the visible items to look at helps. So I'm just going to add a bit of resolution here so I can get a bit more on the nose there. And maybe just a bit more up there. So I'm just adding a little bit of resolution for these. Cool. And maybe just do the lower lip as well. Let's do that somewhere here. So again, just kind of just adjust this a little bit. So we have something to kind of reference. Is it, you know, is the tracking working? Are these things following his face? It's easier for us to see if you have points that are actually, you know, looking at some of the features on his face. Groovy. So that's good enough for that. And this patch, I'm going to just keep it in there. So that's right in the kind of in like almost in right in the middle of this square over here. So cool. And again, smooth everything out with the Z button. Nice and smooth. Now this time, basically what I said earlier is that you have the two grids and we link them, and if they move together, then nothing happens. So if you want to do stabilization, then basically you want to remove that movement. And so what you just kind of really need is you want to have the regional movement, but to stay in that one place. So it's like it's you know, that destination stays there. The regional footage might be moving around. So it's very simple to achieve. You can unlink this, pick whatever frame you want to be your reference frame. So for cleanup work, you might want one that's kind of sort of you know, well adjusted, or like, you know, sort of least blurry or least out of focus, kind of the sharpest frame. And you don't even have to do it at this stage. So I might actually do it the other way around. I might want to leave it more open. So I'm going to track it first and then pick my reference frame. So it's easier. I'm going to draw this on here because I can see things. And I might actually use this as my reference frame anyway. No SmartVector input connected, obviously. So I'm going to do that. And I'm going to show you one quick optimization. Because these SmartVectors, rather than tracking every pixel, they track sort of every other pixel, or, you know, every pixel within an area. I don't really need it to do any work over there or over there. So what I might want to do is I might want to actually reduce the size of my footage before I do any of this work in there. So I'll quickly crop this. And this is a optimization that's not that well known of, but you can simply crop things and reformat. And now we've kind of went from this HD footage to something that's a bit more like half HD. I will need to move this back into place, but my intention is that I now have fewer points to track. Therefore, I will be able to track them a little bit better. Okay, get this to line up with the nose. And I think we have some of them. Cool. So let's track this. Sing my tracking song again. Tracking. Sing my tracking song. Track. 6 more seconds. Track. Groovy. So you can see it's sort of distorting a little bit on that end. And that's kind of why I was saying earlier, I might not want to have any of the points too close to the edge. So I might just actually move this a little bit more inwards, because I'm kind of mostly interested in what's happening on the face and not that far back. So I'm going to And in fact, what we can do as well is we can make our vectors now more detailed because we're dealing with a smaller image. Because we threw away a lot of the image that we're not needing to analyze. The smart vectors, we can do it in more precise detail as well. Let's quickly track this again. Still warping. Oh no, there it is, updated. And track towards the future as well. Track forward. Let's see how that went. It's doing sort of an okay job there. We can see it's sliding a little bit over there, but we'll deal with this in a moment. So let's pick our reference frame, and we just needed to stay still. So I'm going to pick frame 75 as my reference frame. It's a fairly good, oblique view of this. And I don't need this destination grid to be animated anymore. I want it to be not moving on this, frame or any of the other frames. I want it to just stay there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all of the keyframes. First, I unlink them, remove all of the keyframes from this face. So I'm going to remove all keyframes, and I will just add one. You don't need to add one, but it helps me to remember which frame it is. You can kind of write this down here as well. Reference frame 75. But that's fine too. So what we should now have is that we have the original face moving around, but we're warping it to this destination that remains over there. So if you look at our footage now, and I don't think we are looking at it, make sure we are. We should see that the rest of his head is moving around, but that section remains stabilized. And that's really, really nice. So at this stage, you might be like, well, actually, it's still moving a little bit. Could we add some adjustments to it, just kind of on a few frames, to make sure that when it's sort of over there and it starts sliding, could you just add one more keyframe to make sure that it doesn't slide as much? And the trick for that is to actually swap the order of these things, because we can't add adjustments to the from grid. We can only add adjustments to the to grid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy all of my source animation to my destination grid. And in fact, I'm going to then go to my source grid and kill the animation from that instead. Let's see if that worked. I meant to say kill animation. No animation, put one keyframe there. And then, because at the moment now it will be doing sort of the twice the amount of warping. It will move things even further. We have the invert button, which is basically the button in here that kind of changes from stabilization to match move and from match move to stabilization in whichever way you're doing it. So now we have this moving grid moving along, going towards this still grid, which is the from, because we've inverted it. And to this moving grid, we can add a little adjustment grid. So we can find in here the frame in which things are looking fine. So I think we're still happy with the animation until there. And I might just turn off all my other grids so I can see my destination in there. And I'm just going to actually disable it as well. Make sure that I only see the very, very last thing. So as I see it starts to move around, I might just want to kind of follow that movement a little bit by adding a few keyframes to it. So I'll add a keyframe to it manually. Add a manual keyframe. And as it sort of starts sliding, so you can see here on those frames, it starts sliding towards the bottom of this square. So on those frames, I might just want to make sure that I just adjust it a little bit to follow that movement a bit better. And this way, you can actually add some adjustments to this sort of SmartVector workflow, which is something that we've kind of really missed from the SmartVectors in the first place, because SmartVectors are great at kind of making things move the same way as everything else. But when they start slightly going off, there was no way to control them. Now we can. Now we can add a few keyframes in here for adjustments. And if you look at our final result over black, we should see that that little sort of birthmark remains where it was initially, and doesn't move as much. Maybe here my adjustment was a little bit too much. You could kind of move it back a little bit if you have to. There. Cool. So now we've stabilized everything. Let's do a really quick paintwork. Let's view this over source. So frame 75 is my reference frame. I'll do a very quick paint job in here. And whenever painting skin, you want to be using things like Laplacians or sort of frequency tools like this. The idea between Laplacians and these tools is that they allow you to separate the texture of the skin from the general lighting. So if this is the texture, then this would be the general lighting. So that's the texture and that's the lighting. And when you put them back together, you will now have two separate streams that will allow you to treat each of these individually. So you have the texture in one stream and the general color in another stream. So I'm just going to do a quick clone paint in here. Make sure it's happening on all frames because it's stabilized footage. And I've just copied over some of the texture. And I might just make my Laplacian a little bit bigger. There. So copied over some of the texture from there without copying over too much of the lighting. Neat. If you still have a little bit kind of left over here, then you can do another treatment in there. And at some point, then you would kind of want to make sure that you only now composite this part where you've actually done the work that you have done. In order to achieve this, you can do output a protopaint mask that allows you to see where you have done your work. So make sure I merge these as well. And another mask, sorry. Also merge protopaint mask. This will be a plus. Also merge our automatic masks. So that if I now shuffle my rotopaint mask, and this is the new shuffle node in Nuke 12. If I shuffle my rotopaint mask into my alpha, we can see that that's the area that we actually did for the paintwork. So I just need to make sure I have an alpha channel that's big enough to cover this, and just maybe a little bit more. So I'm just going to do this, just do a clamp. Make this all nice and solid. So just looking at my alpha, let's make it solid. And pre-melt this. Shouldn't you use soft edges when you're doing patches on faces? Generally, yes, but here we are actually merging some of the regional skin over itself. So you actually kind of want it hard. You don't need the soft edge in there. So this is great. Now we have a patch, but the problem is it doesn't move. The problem is it's stabilized. It's where we originally made it. So luckily, we already have information about movement in our earlier GridWarpTracker over there. which again, like I said, once you've done the tracking, it doesn't need to be connected to the SmartVectors. So you can just take this GridWarpTracker that you made earlier, and whatever you have done in it, any adjustments, any kind of settings in here, you can simply invert them with this invert button. And this invert button is amazing. It is possible to use the old GridWarp tool as well, and to invert this, but it is confusing. The way to kind of invert the old GridWarp tool is to go to the morph option and change warp to 0 and mix to 1. But it's difficult to remember. You can also do that in here if you go to the morph option and change this to 0 and 1. It will also do the invert, but it's just much easier to press the invert button. Thank you, Foundry, for giving us an invert button. Thank you. This is really nice. So now what we have is basically the regional movement being put back onto this patch. If I don't look at this pre-mult and work that we just did there, we should see the sort of 2 copies of the grid sort of going back towards the regional position where it used to be. I hope so. Okay, let's merge this. Check that we haven't done any mistakes. We should probably have, because it's a live webinar and everything is moving differently. So I'm just going to go in here, go to the morph, set this back to where they need to be, set this to warp. And if my original one was invert, then now I want to do this as not invert. So whatever it was originally, now do it in the opposite direction. If you invert it in the beginning, now don't invert it. You're just, going from stabilize to match move, or from match move to stabilize. That's what the invert button does. Amazing. It has an invert button. Can't stress this enough. And now what we have is this patch hopefully moving along. Unless I've forgotten something. And I think that I have. And just make sure these are all visible. Let's just check this as well. Is this still doing a stabilization? That's all stabilizing. And let's look at this. Is this one moving along? That one is moving along. Ah, I see. So it is working. It's just that because I'm viewing it over the source image, I saw the old copy in there. But if I view it over black, that now gives us the only original copy that's left over. And for visibility, I'll just quickly turn on a shuffle to turn off my original alpha so you can see where it is. Let's make this alpha black. So you can see my patch is moving along, warping along. So the trick is you can stabilize. In order to stabilize, you have to kind of track the regional movement and choose a reference frame. Make sure that either your source or destination grid, whichever way you're doing it, doesn't have any movement anymore. So kill the animation on that. So basically it's moving, but it's keeping the animation there. And then, because in the end you have to undo your stabilizations, you just take your the grid what we did earlier and press the invert button, and that will undo it. So that will put his movement back. Cool. That's kind of everything I wanted to say about these basic setups of the grid warp. I just quickly want to show you a few other things. I'm not going to go through all the steps for building it, of what else you could do with the SmartVectors. So this is the same thing that I built earlier, because again, doing webinars, if my computers had crashed right halfway in the middle, I could have jumped in there just in case. But here's another example of some more recent student work. So here's a student who took some of this footage that we have from Iceland. Ooh, computer is thinking. But occasionally, especially when doing screen sharing, the graphics cards might have a little moan. Just quickly cache this. So here's a clip. And it looks like, just some kind of a war clip. So there's some kind of CG down there, and there's some nice bunkers in there. This is from one of my current students. He did this as one of his MA exercises as well. You can even see some little birds sitting on top of this bunker. And originally, this footage had people down there and no bunkers and no tank traps. So basically, the challenge was to remove the people and to put some CG into this and blend it nicely. So CG blending means things like in the other example, making sure that the lighting works. So this bunker here is more contrasted than the one that, further back. It's more flat. So what you can do sometimes, or like is or what you could do with the GridWarp is help your projections a little bit. So in my case, in this example here, so in projections, the idea is that you put a card somewhere in 3D space, and if your camera moves the same way as the real world camera did, so it will be moving sort of up and down like this. So that's our that's how the real world camera was moving, and how we figure this out is we track a lot of points in the scene, and then once we have tracked those points, then from that track we can sort of figure out how did the camera actually move. And once we know how the camera moved, then we can put elements into the scene that hopefully, if we move the same way, it will stick to it. So in my case, I've just quickly drawn the letter escape over this patch over here, give it a quick alpha channel, and cut it out really lazily, put it on a card, and stick it there. And it sort of looks, okay. If I look at it, I don't necessarily immediately pick anything up, although a senior compositor will. And what you will basically see is that if you compare this with the original footage, you will find that everything has moved a little bit. And this is an issue because you will start getting sort of, some rocks will become duplicated, some will look sort of stretchy. And the reason is that we put a card over there, and as we're moving past this card, that card doesn't have that level of detail in the curvature. So this is where, again, we could use GridWarpTracker instead. But the issue is that if you just use a GridWarpTracker and nothing else, what you will also find is that in that case, the GridWarpTracker, because there's quite a bit of movement, it's down there in the beginning and it's up there at the end of the footage. There's quite a bit of movement that the GridWarpTracker will struggle with this. If you just use a GridWarpTracker, it tries to track things from, initially from down there all the way up there, and that's quite a challenge. It's quite a lot of movement that it has to figure out while figuring out this more precise movement locally. So you might find that actually the GridWarpTracker option doesn't work that well either. It will sort of also slide and stretch. So this is why, in compositing, you don't have tools that just do everything, but you just have many tools. So really what you need to do is you need to combine some of those techniques. So this projection part in here, we were kind of using this virtual camera to make it look like we are adding perspective to this card, but in a similar way, you can use projections, topic for a totally different lesson, to remove some movement from your image. You'll be projecting it with a with a moving camera, but you could view it with a static camera. So basically, one camera keeps on moving, the other camera will stay still. So from the camera's point of view, if we view this card here with some wireframes, then it's not displaying. Then it will look like it's we've stabilized it, and it has done the stabilization. But now what you can see is the lack of detail in this is that the rest of this is still warping a little bit, and even this area that we're interested in, most of it sort of remains in the middle, but it still warps. So if I look at here and here, it has this warping. So again, what you can do is crop things to optimize a little bit, and then do your smart vectors, do your GridWarp tracking over there to track that area, do your stabilizations using the stabilization technique where one of the grids is moving, the other one is not. So basically you're taking the movement and putting it to the non-moving grid. Do your paint work, and then undo your paint work and undo the warping. So now you're putting some of this movement back. So from the still one to the one that actually has the movement. So we're just adding this little bit of warping back to this, and then we put back the general movement of the card using our camera that's actually projecting it onto that card over there. So we putting all this back in there. So in that case, we should see a much better result. It will look good, so it might be a little bit hard to see what it is actually doing. But I'll just kind of go play towards the beginning because my reference frame is in the end. It will definitely look good over there because everything will look good on the reference frame. But in the beginning, we should see a difference where if I just display a grid over all of this, you can see that this is the grid of the card itself. So that's the perspective that we got from the projection. So from the projection, we are getting a little bit of this kind of planar movement, and we are getting a small perspective change from that, and that's great because that's half the job. But what the GridWarpTracker adds, it adds this finer movement. It adds these bits of the movements that are actually missing. So this part in there. So those rocks will be moving a little bit slower. The ones there will be moving. So it adds this small amount of curvature to this, and that I think is nice. So you can kind of take these more advanced tools and combine them with that. And finally, if you do have if you're sometimes feeling very lazy and you're just trying to do a comp where I'm just going to gain this up to make it visible, where you just have to replace something quickly. You have a card, you put into 3D space and you project onto it, but the card doesn't have enough detail. The correct way of doing things is to give your geometry more detail, then your projections will work. But sometimes you just have to do a little bit of adjustments, and you maybe don't have the time or availability to build better geometry. In those cases, you might also actually use the GridWarp tool to try to find this sort of missing parallax from, let's see which frames are we looking at in here. And let's change this to input frame range. So on frame 88, that's the frame that I'm projecting. Everything matches. On frame 111, I wanted to still continue matching. So what I'm actually projecting in here, I'm just taking half of the store, a little bit of the wall as well. And in order to do these adjustments, we can add this extra bit of matching using GridWarps, just kind of this little bit of extra perspective. Again, the card itself will give me give me most of this parallax, but we can give we can help the card a little bit by warping it even more into place. So if I sort of show it over the source, so we're just gonna give it this extra little bit of adjustment there. So the card will give it the overall movement with the projections in 3D, and I might just push it a little bit with my grid warp to give me that little bit of extra that I didn't get from the card. Now I wouldn't always do this, because the issue with grid warp is that all of these points are a little bit round. So if you really wanted to do this kind of properly geometrically, you'd have to make sure that the handles here would be effectively 0, so you would get like real hard corners, because the warping it does is based on the length of these handles as well. But that's just another trick to show you that sometimes if you compare, if I just did a projection with a flat card, and let's stick one there. Let's view this card here. With a flat card, it doesn't match that well as if I do it with a card that I warp. It matches a little bit better. So compare that with that. Not perfect, but better. Excellent. And that concludes everything I wanted to say about that. There is one more thing I will want to say, which I will say in a moment, which is something about next week. But before that, let's have a quick 5 minutes with questions, if that's okay with everyone else in the panel.
Animesh is asking, what is the shortcut key for adding points in the GridWarpTracker? Sorry, GridWarpTracker.
Yep. I don't think there's a shortcut key associated with it. But if you want to add points, basically, in order to add resolution to your grid, let's maybe take this guy here. Then let's gain him. Then I'll just make a new one. Then it is the button on the left, because sometimes you actually want less resolution as well. So you always start with drawing. So it's this button here, that button there, draw boundary, to draw where you actually want your grid to be placed. So that's the starting point always. And then if you want to kind of add resolution to this or remove resolution, then it's this plus button to insert or to delete. And you're not adding one point, you're adding a whole division at the same time. So you're sort of subdividing that section of the grid or that section of the grid. And this is, in some ways, that's one of the limitations of the grid warp, that it will always be a grid. Hopefully, Foundry will extend some of their toolsets and one day do something similar like the GridWarpTracker to spline warps as well. Because spline warps, they are a very nice way where you can actually draw any curve that you want, and then duplicate and join this in, for one of them to be the destination curve and the other one to be the source curve. They don't have the grid warping functionality yet, but we can only hope that maybe one day that will happen. So in order to add that resolution, is this button here. So plus and minus to add the resolution. And like I said as well, sometimes you want to add, sometimes you want to reduce the resolution. And why would you want to reduce resolution is in these examples here where we are doing things like a wall. I actually want fewer points that I need to animate. It's just like the top and bottom of the door and nothing in between. So here I I put the points where I need them to be, and then I delete any excess ones, so I have kind of fewer things that I need to match.
Cool. Another question from Andrea. Is it good just for facial animation? Any different example where can I use this amazing node?
Cool. I think here these other two examples are kind of quite good for that. In that you can combine it with projections, and in particular, because the issue with projections is that you need to have accurate geometry, and if your geometry is slightly curved or has more details, then you need to have geometry like that to match. And we don't always have that. So so the option is we either get more detailed geometry, or we could use something like the GridWarpTracker to get that extra movement, this extra little bit of warping, extra little bit of perspective that we didn't get from this original stabilization here. So you can see here as well, you have it like the front of this is moving a little bit more than the back. Maybe it's not super visible. I'll just play it back here. And these are the kind of things that you can add with the GridWarp. The other thing as well is something that I didn't look at in here, but originally GridWarps as well are actually used quite a lot for doing things like anything to do with cloth or clothes, or kind of rig removal for paintwork. And the idea there is that let's say you wanted to remove this escape logo from here. Ollie is looking at Y, so you can make it bigger and put it all over the chest, obviously. So in those cases, what you would do is you might kind of stabilize it with 1 point first, like do a 1 point tracker, then crop the region that you want. This cropping technique is actually, you don't need to do that, it will work anyway, but I think this cropping section is a good optimization. Then do smart vectors for that, so then you get the actual kind of warping of the cloth. So when you do your clean plate, that clean plate can actually warp nicely as well. And the other thing that I didn't really look at this stage as well is the whole idea between morphing. And morphing is the classic example where, well, the classic examples you do is like you have one person and then you morph them into another person in their face, which you don't really need to do that often. Although these days they're doing more of this kind of stuff. So all this, all the things where, well, like there's a lot of movies where these days you make a lot of people younger, and when you're doing de-aging, you have the lines to get rid of people in people's faces or make their skin texture look a bit better, but also people's noses keep growing until the end of their life. So if you want to make someone look younger, you have to make their nose a little bit smaller. So that's kind of where you do grid warping. But the other idea of grid warping is this morph idea, which is that you can take something like an apple and then kind of morph it into a banana, like I guess they did in old music videos, because that was great. But in practice, we don't do it as much. What we do instead is, in practice, we do things like, if you have a slowly moving light, that light is changing slowly. So let's say I'm, in the beginning, I'm kind of pointing this way, and then I'm pointing this way. Now there's a bit of a shadow on the logo on my face. I might do one clean plate at the end of this. I paint out the patch at the end. I paint out the other patch in the beginning. And then, because they're both tracked, I can slowly dissolve from one patch to another. So maybe that's material for a whole other webinar in there. So yes, there's definitely other cases for this. And the face expression, that's like I said, that's why I started with that as well. It's like, that's the classic example. But that's not really the main use case. So in some ways here, the stabilization workflow, that's the new thing. Is like, that's something that was very difficult to achieve if you didn't know how to get to it using GridWarps. But now with the GridWarps, it has the invert button. Love that invert button. It's amazing.
Federico is just asking, so the invert button, allows you to switch between stabilize and match move? Question mark.
Basically, yes. It is kind of whatever you've been doing with your warping. So if your warping is making something bigger, so I'll just quickly do a grid warp on his face, and I'll quickly, whoops, that's the old grid warp. Let's keep pressing the same thing. GridWarpTracker. There we are. So, for example, if we thought his eye could look bigger and cooler, then here, if I just take these guys and I make this area bigger, let's see if Nuke lets me do that. There, epic. Let's view it over the original image as well because of fun. So now we can see if I quickly just view before and after. So we can see that's what it's doing. It's at the moment we're our source was wherever it was, and the 2 is bigger. So in our case, if we now were to take and swap those 2, it will be doing the opposite effect. So the opposite effect in here would be making it smaller. So now it has a tiny eye. So if what you were doing is basically having one of the curves following the movement and the other one still, then basically it just depends which way you're doing this animation. You're either going from the still frame to the movement or from the movement to the still frame. So basically, yeah, it's an invert. It changes the order of these things. And like I said, it was possible to do this in the last grid warp as well. But by going through the morph settings and playing with the dissolve and mix and the other slider, and it was confusing. The invert button just makes it epic.
Hi, Ollie and Allar. Would you recommend using grid warp or making actual geometry for this kind of projections?
Excellent question. In those 2 examples, I would actually make geometry. In those particular examples there. So for this thing in here, because I didn't actually show you the final result of this other murder scene. I'll need to show you that as well because it's cool. So for this one, you can use the point cloud generator in Nuke, and for this it will do a fairly good job at approximating this. I know because Rob, who did this comp, actually did use it, and he even used it to kind of cut out where this geometry is meant to join with that part in there. So that actually worked quite nicely. And for this work with the door down here, this I would also definitely do this part with the geometry. However, if your shot itself has a little bit kind of more parallax, let's say this window, then for that window, I might be like, actually, if I just do a card and trying to get the geometry to build the geometry for these little bits in between, it's going to be a bit tedious, and actually to get those depths right as well and not have double projections in those cases. So for this bit in the window where it's a small difference, that part I might actually do with a grid warp. And then the question of whether you use the old grid warp or basically the grid warp, because that's actually these days I don't use the old grid warp node. I just use it for any grid warping because it's invertible. You don't have to track it. But if you just kind of do the 2 keyframes with that, or if you track it, then it's kind of up to you. So yeah. So while you're reading this other question, I just wanted to show what our students did with this shot as well, because they turned it into a cool murder scene. I just wanted to show you this. So yeah, Ollie, what else do people want to know?
Last question, I think, and I think this would be quite a good one to just finish on. Alfie's asking, hi, would you say Nuke is a hard software to learn?
Yes, it is. It is not a friendly one. But and I think like my sort of kind of best comparison with this is and maybe this is why students are kind of doing these murder scenes when they learn with me. But what I really like about this scene is he made like all these flies as well. It's like, and these flies are massive. They're like it's a moth cloud. Anyways, but I think learning Nuke is a little bit like learning learning the violin or learning the cello, which is that you have to practice quite a bit before it starts actually sounding good. Whereas something like After Effects is a bit more like a piano or a guitar. Even if you don't know anything, but it just kind of, if you put the fingers in the right place, it actually sounds kind of nice. You just kind of do the one chord. It's like, well, actually that's surprisingly easy. With a violin, you have there's no frets. There's like it's just but then once you do get it, then you will be able to do a lot more than you would do with other softwares. So, and that's kind of why, I think it's definitely good to practice some of this on your own, but it might be a little bit tricky to get good at this stuff on your own as well. You need a lot of practice. So I think that's where courses are actually helpful, that guide you through this. Is like, okay, this bit is going to be painful for a while, but it's okay. There is a reason why we're doing this exercise, because this is kind of like again, learning an instrument. Why are we doing scales every day? Why aren't we just playing songs and tunes? Well, knowing these scales is what you need in order to to actually do the work. But in the end, the other thing as well is that we teach whatever software here that the industry uses, and the industry also uses whatever they need or whatever does the job the best. But also it really, what you're learning here is you're learning the principles of compositing. These are just the tools that we use it. But if you actually want to learn compositing, then it's all the questions of how dark should the red color be. If you put something there, you should see it in the reflection as well. This is actually the compositing. Nuke is just a tool that we use for this. So use whatever tool you want. If it's really the principles of comp that you want to learn as well, and that's something we're good at teaching too.